He watched her smile through the veil, kissed her forehead as she called him the love of her life, and promised her forever. Hours later, while she thought she was stepping into the start of a marriage, he was quietly preparing her end. This wasn't rage. This wasn't madness in the moment. It was deliberate. Cold. Practiced. The weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a wedding ring. A covenant twisted into a countdown. But what happens when a woman survives the crash her husband designed? What if she remembers the one detail he prayed she would forget? Tonight, we unravel a story that looks like love from the outside, but on the inside was a blueprint for murder. This is not a tale of passion gone wrong. This is a case where marriage itself was turned into a weapon. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Elena Whitford was born on February 9, 1988, in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was the first daughter of Samuel and Lorraine Whitford, a couple who had built their lives around community, church, and quiet discipline. Samuel was a postal worker who woke before dawn each day, while Lorraine was a nurse known for her steady hands and softer voice. Their home was modest, but it was warm, and their daughters grew up surrounded by scriptures, structure, and the kind of small-town values that make people believe evil only happens somewhere else. From a young age, Elena stood out. She wasn't loud, she wasn't reckless, but she carried a quiet presence that drew people in. Teachers described her as responsible beyond her years. At 14, she was volunteering at a food pantry. At 16, she was tutoring neighborhood kids in algebra. By 19, she was teaching Sunday school, balancing lesson plans with her own college coursework. Everyone said she had an old soul, a calmness that made others trust her instantly. Her friends noticed she never rushed anything. Not decisions, not friendships, not relationships. In a world where people move fast, dating, breaking up, moving on, Elena was deliberate. She said love wasn't about butterflies. It was about purpose. It had to mean something beyond attraction. She wanted a marriage that felt ordained, not improvised. By her late 20s, she had checked off nearly every box: a degree in childhood education from East Carolina University, a steady job at a private school, and her own townhouse near the city center. But one box remained empty: romance. There had been offers. A few boyfriends from college, some men from her choir who admired her discipline, but nothing had ever stuck. She told her younger sister once, "I'm waiting on the right assignment, not just the right man." It was that belief that made her so vulnerable when Marcus Hale appeared. Elena met Marcus at a community leadership conference in Durham, spring of 2016. She was sipping water in the back row, scribbling notes about a session on faith-based mentoring. Marcus didn't make an entrance, didn't flash a badge or a business card. But when he spoke, steady and low, quoting scripture as if it rolled off his tongue without effort, people listened. Including Elena. He introduced himself later, not with flirtation, but with curiosity. He commented on her notes. Asked about her Sunday school program. He didn't press for her number right away. Instead, he left just enough space between interactions to build anticipation. He called her queen early on, but not in the slick, rehearsed way Elena had grown accustomed to ignoring online. With Marcus, it felt intentional. Gentle. Almost reverent. He shared stories of pain, too, about losing a fiancé years earlier, about carrying grief through seasons of loneliness. He said he wasn't looking for glamour, just for the rib God had set aside for him. Elena had prayed those very words, whispered them into her pillow at night. Hearing them from him felt like a sign. She saw alignment, not warning. Rescue, not red flags. Within months, Marcus had woven himself into every part of her life. He wasn't just present. He was consistent. Respectful. He knew when to speak and when to stay silent. To her friends and family, he looked like an answered prayer. To Elena, he felt like a covenant. The proposal came a year later, unannounced, after a church fast. There was no flashy ring reveal, no staged photos. Just Marcus, on one knee in the church parking lot, whispering, "It's your turn to be carried." Elena didn't hesitate. She said yes before the tears even fell. Her parents were overjoyed. Her sister told her, "He looks at you like you're already home." But while Elena was planning the playlist for her wedding reception, Marcus was at a shipping store on the east side of Raleigh, quietly filling out paperwork. Insurance paperwork. A life insurance policy worth $1.5 million, activated only in the case of accidental death. 2 days before the ceremony, he submitted it. Smiling. Calm. Knowing exactly what clause he was counting on. The wedding itself was simple. Behind New Hope Baptist Church, the same church where Elena had been baptized as a girl, they exchanged handwritten vows. Her words were filled with gratitude and patience. His were smooth, rehearsed, and, to anyone listening closely, haunting. By sundown, they drove off in a white sedan Marcus had rented for a quiet weekend near the coast. To friends, it looked like the beginning of forever. But Marcus already had directions prepared. Already had a plan for how Elena would drive alone down a scenic route. Already knew what would happen when her brakes failed. Because this wasn't love. This was design. And Elena Whitford was walking straight into it. Raleigh, North Carolina, isn't the kind of city most people associate with dark secrets. Known for its oak-lined streets, historic churches, and the hum of university life, it's the kind of place that markets itself as safe, steady, a community where neighbors wave from porches and Sunday mornings are reserved for family pews. But in stories like this, evil doesn't always arrive from the outside. Sometimes it grows quietly inside the very places people feel safest. For Elena Whitford, Raleigh was home, and everything about her upbringing was built on the pillars of faith, discipline, and community. Her father, Samuel, had worked for nearly 3 decades with the U.S. Postal Service. He was a man who lived by routine, same breakfast every morning, same jacket in every season, always early to work, never late to church. Her mother, Lorraine, was a pediatric nurse whose soft touch and quiet voice made her a legend at St. Mary's Medical Center. Together, they raised their daughters in a home where kindness wasn't optional. It was expected. Elena absorbed those values deeply. Childhood friends remembered her as the girl who said sorry even when someone bumped into her. Teachers remembered her as the one who tutored struggling classmates without ever being asked. She didn't seek attention, but attention found her. By the time she was in high school, Elena was balancing straight A's with volunteer hours at a local food pantry. On Sundays, she was the teenager running a small Bible study for children, her voice steady, her patience remarkable. By 19, Elena had earned a reputation beyond her church walls. She was leading prayer calls for women twice her age, often quoting scripture with the kind of conviction people usually only found in seasoned pastors. Her friends said she carried herself with an old soul, someone who seemed born to guide others, not chase after fleeting things. And yet, there was one part of her life that remained conspicuously untouched: romance. She had dated casually in college, a coffee here, a concert there, but nothing ever became serious. She told friends she was waiting on something ordained, not improvised. When pressed, she would explain that love, to her, wasn't about feelings that faded or excitement that burned out quickly. It was about purpose. It had to align with God's plan. This careful, deliberate approach to love meant that, by the time Elena reached her late 20s, she had a full resume, college degree, respected teaching position, financial independence, her own home, but no partner. Her friends sometimes teased her gently, calling her the saint of patience. But Elena never felt insecure about it. "I'd rather wait 10 years for the right one," she once told her sister, "than spend 1 year with the wrong one." It was this mindset that made her encounter with Marcus Hale feel like destiny rather than coincidence. Marcus came from a different world. Born in Charlotte, raised mostly by his grandmother after his parents split, Marcus was known for his charisma. He had a way of walking into a room and commanding attention without trying. His voice was deep, steady, and he knew how to use it. He studied business for a time, but never finished. Instead, he floated between jobs: youth coordinator at a church, part-time consultant, occasional motivational speaker. On paper, his career path looked scattered. In person, he looked polished. When Marcus and Elena met at that leadership conference in Durham, he knew exactly how to present himself. He wasn't flashy, but he was intentional. His questions were thoughtful, his timing calculated. He didn't ask for Elena's number immediately, he waited, then followed up through email with a carefully worded message about the session they'd attended. He complimented her insights, asked for her perspective on scripture, and signed off with, "Stay encouraged, Queen." To Elena, who had prayed for years for a man who would lead with faith, this felt like more than coincidence. It felt like alignment. Within weeks, Marcus had inserted himself into her world seamlessly. He attended her church services, introduced himself to her parents, helped her carry supplies for her Sunday school lessons. He listened when she spoke about her dreams, echoed her values, mirrored her convictions. He told her about his late fiancée, how he had proposed only to lose her in a tragic accident months later. He said he hadn't dated seriously since, that he was waiting for someone God had specifically chosen for him. Those words struck Elena like lightning. She had prayed for that exact kind of story, for a man who valued patience, who wasn't chasing glamour but was waiting for his rib. Marcus seemed like the answer. But what Elena couldn't see, what no one could see, was how much of Marcus's story was carefully constructed. The late fiancé, the tragic heartbreak, the vow of patience. It all worked to soften Elena's defenses. And it worked. By the time Marcus proposed in the church parking lot a year later, Elena didn't hesitate. She said yes before the tears even hit her cheeks. Her parents were overjoyed. Her sister said, "He looks at you like you're already home." And to anyone on the outside, it looked like the perfect pairing, faithful woman, steady man, a marriage rooted in prayer. But in the shadows, Marcus wasn't planning a marriage. He was planning an exit. 2 weeks before the wedding, while Elena was finalizing floral arrangements and music playlists, Marcus was filling out paperwork for a $1.5 million life insurance policy. A policy that required one very specific condition to be triggered: accidental death. Not illness. Not natural causes. It had to be sudden, physical, and unexpected. And that's exactly what Marcus was designing. The wedding was everything Elena had ever wanted: simple, reverent, free of unnecessary spectacle. On a mild Saturday morning in late spring, the Whitfords' backyard at New Hope Baptist Church was transformed into a modest garden ceremony. There were no doves released into the sky, no extravagant decor, just folding chairs on a neatly trimmed lawn, strings of soft white lights, and a wooden arch decorated with magnolia blossoms. To the Whitford family, this wasn't just another ceremony. It was sacred ground. The same church had baptized Elena as a child, the same church her parents had renewed their vows after 30 years together. Marcus arrived early, pressed in a charcoal gray suit, his tie tucked perfectly, his face composed. He greeted guests with polite nods but little conversation. When Elena appeared, cream dress, hair pinned softly, bouquet trembling in her hands, the air seemed to hold still. She walked the narrow aisle with a grace that silenced every cough and whisper. Marcus mouthed thank you to the sky as she approached, and those who saw it thought it was gratitude. No one asked what he was really grateful for. The vows were handwritten. Elena spoke first, her voice cracking with emotion as she thanked Marcus for patience, for protection, for the calm he had brought into her once quiet life. She ended with words that made her parents weep openly: "You saw me. You carried me. You chose me." Marcus followed, his tone smooth, his delivery flawless, but behind every phrase there was an odd stillness, a script rehearsed too many times. By afternoon, the couple had changed into matching linen outfits, hugging each guest one by one, thanking the caterers personally, bowing their heads as relatives prayed over them. At 5:15 p.m., they climbed into a rented white sedan Marcus had arranged. No sparklers, no rice, just prayers whispered into the air and phone cameras snapping what looked like the beginning of forever. But Marcus had already orchestrated the next chapter. That evening, as golden light faded into dusk, Marcus leaned toward Elena and kissed her forehead again. He told her he'd meet her at their weekend retreat on Hilton Head Island, but suggested she take her own car for the drive down. She hesitated, but insisted her belongings were still packed in her trunk. Driving her own car, she said, made her feel more herself. He nodded gently, like a man willing to bend for his bride, then slipped her a folded piece of paper. "Take the scenic route," he whispered. "It's quieter, more peaceful. You'll love it." The paper had precise directions scribbled across it, leading her off the highway, onto winding coastal roads where cell service was patchy and traffic thinned after dark. Elena kissed him once more before stepping into her silver sedan. She turned the ignition, waved to her family still lingering outside, and pulled away. Marcus stood on the curb, one hand lifted, the other slipped calmly into his pocket. For Elena, the first hour felt like freedom. The air smelled of salt water, the windows were cracked just enough for the wind to tangle her hair. She replayed the vows in her head, the tears in her father's eyes, the way her mother had squeezed her hand. She hummed softly to a gospel track streaming from her phone, convinced that everything she had waited for was finally beginning. But as the road curved sharply near Bluffton, something shifted. The brake pedal felt looser than usual, a subtle delay she couldn't quite name. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe the road's incline was steeper than she thought. But minutes later, as she pressed harder, the car didn't slow. It glided forward, unerringly light, as if the machine itself had lost its anchor. Panic rose. Elena pressed again, harder. Nothing. She yanked the steering wheel, swerving to avoid a guardrail, her hands trembling, her breaths coming in broken gasps. She pumped the brakes, still nothing. The car picked up speed, hurtling down a stretch of two-lane road with trees crowding the shoulders. Her mind blurred. The vows. The kiss on her forehead. The folded paper with scenic route written in his handwriting. And then the impact. The sedan crashed violently into the guardrail, metal twisting like paper, glass shattering in a spray of cold fragments. The airbag deployed, slamming against her chest, her body jerking forward before being thrown violently back. A blinding white light filled her vision. She tasted blood. Her last coherent thought was a prayer, unfinished, slipping from her lips in silence. At 10:29 a.m. the following morning, a 911 call came through reporting a wreck along Bluffton's coastal highway. Paramedics arrived within minutes to find Elena's car crumpled against steel. Her body was twisted against the driver's seat, blood streaking her forehead, shards of glass embedded in her arms. She was unconscious, her pulse weak but present. They stabilized her barely, collapsed lung, broken ribs, fractured pelvis, internal bleeding. She was airlifted to St. Mary's Medical Center in Charleston, her life hanging by threads of breath and prayer. Back in Raleigh, Marcus received the call. Witnesses would later recall how he dropped to his knees in the hospital hallway, Bible pressed to his forehead, sobbing loudly enough for strangers to join his cries. He begged God to spare her, called her his angel, clutched the hands of nurses and chaplains alike. To everyone watching, he looked like a husband shattered by tragedy. But what no one knew, what only later evidence would prove, was that this wasn't tragedy at all. It was choreography. And Marcus Hale was the conductor. At St. Mary's Medical Center, the ICU wing was hushed except for the steady rhythm of machines. Elena Whitford lay pale and motionless beneath white hospital sheets, her chest rising unevenly with the aid of tubes and wires. Doctors had listed her injuries with grim precision: collapsed lung, broken ribs, fractured pelvis, internal bleeding, and a head injury that should have silenced her permanently. Yet her pulse held on, stubborn and steady, like a quiet refusal to let go. For her family, those first hours were agony. Her mother, Lorraine, sat vigil at the bedside, worn Bible open in her lap, whispering psalms with a voice that cracked after each verse. Samuel stood at the foot of the bed, muttering prayers under his breath as if trading his voice for hers. Elena's sister, Amelia, brushed through her tangled hair with trembling hands, humming softly to fill the silence. The waiting room became a revolving prayer circle, strangers clutching one another's hands, repeating the same desperate word, survive. And then there was Marcus. To anyone watching, he was the model of a grieving husband. He dropped to his knees in the hallway, pressed his forehead against his Bible, and wept until his body shook. He begged strangers to pray with him, clasping their hands, quoting scripture between sobs. Nurses whispered to one another that his cries were almost theatrical, too loud, too perfectly timed, but none of them said it aloud. To the staff, Marcus was a man losing the woman he loved. But beneath the performance, his intentions were sharper. Marcus quickly took control of Elena's access. He told staff she needed peace, that too many visitors would overwhelm her fragile state. At first, it sounded reasonable. But soon, close friends who had driven hours were turned away at the ICU desk. College roommates who carried flowers and handwritten prayers were told, "She's not receiving visitors." Even Elena's colleagues from her school were denied entry. Amelia noticed it first. Each time she entered the room, Marcus was already there, standing at the door like a gatekeeper. He allowed family in shifts, never more than 2 at a time, and always kept himself close enough to overhear every word. If anyone dared to ask what exactly happened on that road, Marcus pressed his fingers to his temple, feigning grief. "I don't know all the details," he would say, voice trembling. "All I know is the car failed her." Then he would turn away, as if the weight of it was too much to bear. But his control stretched further than just visitation. Nurses recalled overhearing him in the family lounge, asking quiet but pointed questions. How soon could funeral arrangements be made if the worst happened? Did they process closed casket requests? Was it possible to expedite death certificates for insurance purposes? His tone wasn't frantic. It was calm, deliberate, as if confirming hotel reservations rather than preparing for his wife's burial. One nurse admitted later that she froze when she overheard him say she was private. She wouldn't want anything big. The words felt rehearsed, like something he had been waiting to say. Meanwhile, Elena's progress defied medical expectation. Her brain scans showed no swelling, no fractures. Doctors had braced for a coma that might last months, but after just 2 weeks, they began to see subtle flickers of awareness, her eyes darting under closed lids, fingers twitching, faint murmurs when her mother leaned close. Marcus didn't celebrate those signs. In fact, witnesses noticed the opposite. His visits grew shorter, his posture tighter, his sobs more forced. When doctors reported that Elena might soon regain partial speech, Marcus began making more calls outside, hushed conversations that ended quickly whenever someone walked past. And then, the first crack appeared. It was Amelia who caught him sitting by Elena's bed, scrolling through her phone. He wasn't texting, wasn't calling anyone. He was deleting. Message threads vanished one by one, bank alerts, email notifications. When Amelia asked what he was doing, Marcus smiled, gentle as always, and said, "She hates clutter. I'm just cleaning up her inbox." He handed the phone back with a shrug, as though it were a small kindness. But Amelia's stomach nodded. She didn't argue in the moment. Instead, she slipped the phone into her purse and kept it. That same week, while Elena's family clung to hope, Marcus visited the UPS store on East Raleigh Avenue again. Surveillance cameras later confirmed it. He carried a manila envelope, just as he had weeks earlier. This time, he asked about notarization. Paperwork regarding life insurance policies. Staff remembered his composure, polite, calm, professional. Not once did he mention that his wife was clinging to life in an ICU bed less than 10 miles away. By the 3rd week, whispers began to ripple. Nurses exchanged wary glances. Church members, once eager to pray with Marcus, kept their distance. Even the chaplain admitted privately that his tears seemed rehearsed. The mask was slipping, not because Marcus changed, but because Elena did. She began to stir. One night, just past midnight, a nurse recorded the first audible whisper. Elena's lips cracked open, dry and trembling, and formed the word "breaks." The sound was fragile, almost inaudible, but it was there. Hours later, when Amelia leaned close, Elena whispered again, "The brakes didn't work." I pressed, nothing happened. The words shattered the narrative Marcus had so carefully built. For weeks, he had repeated the same refrain: it was an accident, a tragic failure, nothing more. But Elena was saying otherwise. The brakes hadn't failed. They had been taken from her. Detective Aaron Keller was no stranger to wrecks. For nearly 15 years, he had walked twisted highways and cataloged mangled vehicles. Most of the time, what he saw fit into familiar patterns: speeding, distraction, a driver too tired to notice the curve ahead. But when he stood in front of Elena Whitford's silver sedan at the Charleston impound lot, something in his gut told him this wasn't routine. The car looked almost staged. The brake lines weren't worn, weren't corroded. They weren't snapped by force of impact. They were sliced, clean, deliberate, surgical. Keller crouched low, flashlight cutting across the shredded rubber. His pen hovered over his notepad before he scribbled the word, "cut." That alone wasn't enough. But it was a thread. And detectives know what to do with threads. Keller began to pull at it. He interviewed paramedics who had arrived at the crash. Their reports were clear: no skid marks on the pavement, no sign Elena had managed to slow before impact. Mechanics confirmed his suspicions: brakes had been tampered with. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, delaying total failure just long enough to make the car move, then collapse when the driver least expected. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Elena's whispers grew stronger. She told her sister Amelia, "The brakes, they didn't work. I pressed hard. Nothing happened." She repeated it days later, this time in front of a nurse who wrote the statement into her daily chart. It was fragile, imperfect testimony, but it was a beginning. Marcus noticed. And Marcus adjusted. He grew colder in the hallways, sharper when Amelia questioned him. Once, when she pressed him about the folded paper of scenic directions, his smile faltered. "You think I wanted this?" he snapped, then immediately softened his tone, adding, "Don't let grief make you paranoid." But paranoia wasn't Amelia's burden anymore. It was clarity. Her suspicion led her to contact Keller, who agreed to meet her at a diner off the interstate. She came armed not with evidence but with unease: stories of Marcus deleting messages, limiting visitors, and asking prematurely about funeral costs. Keller listened, tapping his pen against the coffee mug. When she finished, he slid a printed still across the table. It was grainy, captured from a neighbor's side yard security camera near Elena's townhouse. The timestamp read 11:17 p.m., 3 days before the wedding. A man in a hoodie bent over the hood of Elena's car, half hidden in shadows. The footage wasn't crisp, but the shoes, the posture, the frame, they were Marcus's. Amelia's stomach sank. Keller leaned closer. This wasn't an accident. He rehearsed it. The evidence began to build like bricks stacked one on another. Forensic analysts combed through Marcus's digital footprint. In a folder he thought deleted, cached browser data revealed damning searches: how to disable brakes without triggering sensors, how long before brake fluid leaks cause failure, will car crash trigger life insurance payout. Every query was timestamped in the weeks before the wedding. Then came the insurance policy itself. Elena had no knowledge of it. The signature was hers in name only, but handwriting experts quickly confirmed it was forged. Even more damning, the digital filing came from a cafe Wi-Fi network in downtown Raleigh on the exact day Elena was in Beaufort with her mother for wedding hair trials. Marcus had filed it himself, using her name. Piece by piece, the mask Marcus wore began to crumble. The greeting husband with the Bible pressed to his forehead was replaced by a calculating man with a plan worth $1.5 million. Word spread quietly among hospital staff first. Updates stopped coming voluntarily. Per circles shrank. People began to avoid him in the cafeteria. Even the chaplain who once sat at his side started keeping conversations brief. Marcus felt the shift, sensed the whispers trailing him like shadows. And then, the moment that sealed it. 8 weeks after the crash, Elena was strong enough to sit upright in her bed, her voice fragile but clear. In a small, closed-door meeting with Keller and Amelia present, she repeated the same detail: "He told me to take that road. He kissed me, gave me the paper, and told me it would give me peace." When the brakes failed, I remembered that slip of paper. Her hand trembled as she mimed the act of pressing the pedal. I pressed. Nothing. I pressed again. Still nothing. And in that moment, I knew, her eyes welled with tears. I knew he wanted me gone. The detective nodded solemnly. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was testimony. And it was enough to transform suspicion into prosecution. On July 28, 2019, detectives walked into Abundant Life Worship Center during midweek Bible study. Marcus had just finished leading a reflection from the book of James. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, he read aloud, his voice steady. Moments later, officers stepped forward, placed handcuffs around his wrists, and let him pass stunned congregants. Some gasped. Some bowed their heads. Others just stared, silent, as the mask was torn away in real time. The turning point had arrived. And from that moment forward, the case of the people versus Marcus Hale was no longer about a tragic accident. It was about intent. It was about betrayal wrapped in vows, and a husband who prayed with his lips while plotting with his hands. The state of North Carolina versus Marcus Hale opened on a humid September morning. By the time the jury filed into the Wake County Courthouse, whispers of the case had already spread through church congregations, neighborhood groups, and local news broadcasts. What once appeared to be a tragic accident was now understood as a carefully orchestrated attempt on a woman's life. The prosecution wasted no time. Their opening statement was simple, direct, and devastating. This case is not about a car crash, the lead prosecutor declared, pacing slowly in front of the jury. This case is about intent. It is about a man who married not for love, but for money. A man who prayed in public while plotting in private. A man who cut brake lines, forged signatures, and stood to gain $1.5 million if his wife died before she ever finished unpacking her wedding gifts. Behind the prosecutor's words, a screen flickered with images, photographs of Elena's mangled sedan, close-ups of the severed brake line, grainy security footage of a hooded figure bending over her car in the dead of night. The jurors leaned forward, some with narrowed eyes, others with jaws clenched. The evidence came in layers. First, the digital trail, browser histories pulled from Marcus's cloud backups, showing search queries about disabling brakes, life insurance payouts, and timing mechanical failures. Each search was timestamped, each one predating the crash. The defense attempted to dismiss them as curiosity, claiming Marcus had once worked on cars and simply researched mechanics. But the prosecution reminded jurors, Marcus was not a mechanic. He was a man who filed a $1 million insurance policy 2 days before his wedding. Then came the insurance forms themselves. Handwriting experts confirmed Elena's signature was forged. The notary who processed the documents testified that Marcus had brought them in alone, claiming his fiancée couldn't make the appointment. Digital forensics traced the submission to a coffee shop Wi-Fi in downtown Raleigh on the very day Elena was miles away in Beaufort with her mother. One by one, the building blocks of his mask were stripped away. And then, the moment no one in the courtroom forgot, Elena's testimony. 8 months after the crash, still wearing a neck brace, her gait slow and uneven, Elena walked into the courtroom. Gasps rippled across the room as she steadied herself with her sister's arm. She wore a cream sweater, minimal makeup, her hair pulled simply back. The weight of her survival filled the room before she even spoke. Her voice, though fragile, carried. She described the folded paper Marcus had handed her, how he'd kissed her forehead and told her the scenic route would bring her peace. She described pressing the brake pedal again and again, panic mounting as nothing happened. She described the split-second realization that the man she had married wanted her gone. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice did not break. Love doesn't ask you to die for it, she said. It doesn't lead you to a road it already knows you won't leave. The jury sat motionless. Even the defense attorney avoided her gaze. The defense tried to paint Marcus as a grieving husband framed by coincidence and faulty mechanics. They brought in an expert who suggested brake lines could rupture under the right strain. But the prosecution countered with its own expert, a mechanic who held up the cut line in his gloved hands and explained, with clinical precision, how the slice was too clean to be accidental. "This wasn't wear and tear," he said. "This was sabotage." Marcus himself never took the stand. He sat rigid, suit pressed, Bible on the table in front of him, but his once steady demeanor had hardened into silence. Gone were the loud sobs, the dramatic prayers, the public displays of grief. In their place was a tight jaw, a man cornered by evidence he could no longer explain away. Closing arguments cemented the image. The prosecutor faced the jury one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen the truth." He prayed for the cameras while plotting for the money. He deleted her messages, forged her name, and cut her breaks. He didn't cry because he was losing a wife. He cried because he thought he was about to collect a payout. Do not let his performance blind you. Look at the evidence. Look at her. This is not love. This is attempted murder. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts: attempted first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and aggravated assault. Marcus Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, Elena exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her family wept quietly behind her. Some jurors wiped their own tears as they filed out. The chapter of doubt had ended. The truth had prevailed. In the days that followed, headlines spread across the state. Bible study leader guilty of attempted murder. Bride survives husband's $1.5 million plot. Talk shows dissected the case, pastors issued careful statements, and neighbors whispered about how someone who once quoted scripture with ease could harbor such darkness. For Elena, though, the trial wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming her own voice. She founded the Remembered Wife Foundation, a small but powerful nonprofit aimed at helping women trapped in relationships where faith and love are weaponized as control. She spoke publicly about terms like gaslighting, financial coercion, and spiritual abuse, patterns that don't always appear in police reports but often serve as precursors to physical violence. Her message was simple, but it carried weight: he didn't kill me. But I still had to come back from something. And I want every woman who survives what doesn't look like survival to know she's not alone. For every headline, every courtroom gasp, every revelation of Marcus's deception, Elena's survival remained the most profound evidence of all. Not evidence against him, but evidence for her, that resilience could rise from wreckage, that truth could cut through manipulation, that even on the road designed to end her life, she found a way back. The case was closed. The verdict delivered. But the echo of it, the chilling reminder that love can be weaponized, lingered far beyond the courtroom walls. When the iron doors of Central Prison closed behind Marcus Hale, his name faded into the long list of men who once believed love could be a mask for greed. But outside those walls, the echoes of his betrayal still lingered, not as fear, but as a lesson written in pain and survival. For Elena, the story did not end in that courtroom. It could never have ended there. Every morning she woke to the ache in her bones, the stiffness in her neck, the faint scar across her forehead where the windshield had shattered. Every glance at the mirror reminded her of what almost happened, what was meant to silence her forever. Yet those reminders became something else, proof that she had outlasted him. Proof that she carried forward what he could not destroy. The community, once divided in whispers, was Marcus framed? Could it have been an accident? Found themselves facing a harder truth. Evil did not always wear a scowl or carry a weapon. Sometimes it wore a pressed suit and a practice prayer. Sometimes it held your hand at the altar. Local pastors delivered sermons on vigilance, warning their congregations that faith should not blind discernment. Women's shelters reported a spike in calls, wives and girlfriends emboldened by Elena's testimony, whispering their own fears into late-night hotlines. Detectives who worked the case said it became a training example for cadets, a reminder that the most dangerous crimes often hide beneath the thinnest veils of normalcy. Elena herself became something she never expected, a voice. She stood before audiences, college students, women's groups, even law enforcement conferences, and told her story not as tragedy, but as testimony. She spoke of patterns, sudden financial moves, isolation disguised as protection, charm that curdled into control. Her voice did not tremble. She looked strangers in the eye and told them, "I married a man I thought was my safe place. Instead, he became my cage. If it could happen to me, it can happen to others. And if I can walk out alive, so can you." Her foundation grew slowly, funded by small donations, built on volunteer hours. But its mission was powerful, to remind survivors that silence is not safety, that leading is not failure, that love is not supposed to hurt. Each story she heard from other women became another brick in the wall of resilience she was building, not just for herself, but for all of them. On the anniversary of the crash, Elena returned to the stretch of highway where her life had nearly ended. The guardrail had been replaced, the skid marks long faded. She placed a single sunflower in the grass by the road, not for Marcus, not even for the life insurance he never collected, but for herself. A marker not of loss, but of survival. She whispered a prayer, not for him, but for every woman still trapped in the shadows of men like him. And then, as the sun set over the Carolina pines, she turned away. Because the story that began with her husband's betrayal was no longer his story to own. It was hers. In the end, the case of Marcus Hale was not about insurance policies or forged signatures. It was about the quiet ways control seeps in, the silent rehearsals of manipulation, the masks people wear until they crack. It was about how darkness can thrive in the most ordinary places, church halls, wedding vows, hospital rooms. But more than that, it was about light. Because no matter how carefully Marcus planned, no matter how many prayers he recited for appearances, no matter how certain he was that Elena's life would end on that rural road, he underestimated one thing: the resilience of the human spirit. Elena's survival was not an accident. It was defiance. Her testimony was not just evidence. It was a declaration. And her life, scarred but unbroken, became the final verdict that no court could ever overturn. The lesson remains: trust is sacred, but it must be earned. Love is powerful, but it should never cost your life. And sometimes, the most haunting true crime stories are not the ones that end in death, but the ones where life endures against all odds.